in an Apple store this week just to pick up a cable, but ended up walking out with this thing, the Steelseries Stratus. It's a Bluetooth iOS joypad for the iPod, the iPhone or the iPad, particularly suited for the iPad because it doesn't have to hold the device in the middle of it. It works with iOS 7 or above, so it's the more recent devices. It's got a cover included that's supposed to hold on the front of the back. Issues with that, I'll explain more about that later on. On the back of the box here, it says it's got 10 hours plus a wireless play. Haven't tested that out, although hopefully it's true. This is a bit of a shock. £60. £60 for a Bluetooth controller, that's a bit insane. So that's why I wanted to review it, to show you whether it was actually worth the money. On the side here, if you can scan that in, whatever piece of software you've got, that'll take you to that link at the bottom. That'll tell you the games that work with this at the moment. Of course, that list will be increasing in number all the time because it's the MFi, the made for iOS spec, so there's always going to be new games added onto that. It's not a spec just for this controller, it's kind of a universal one. There's a little pair of pants, or a zip-up case I suppose, to hold the controller in. It's got a cable here, a USB micro cable to charge it up with. Notice how quick my new camera's focusing on that. I'm using a Sony RX10 now. I got sick of those micro 4/3 cameras, they weren't working. There is the little back for the thing. I'll explain what the problem is with this now. The idea with this is it's supposed to go on either the back to increase the sort of grip, or go on the front to protect it while you're carrying it around, presumably to stop fluff and debris and stuff getting in between the buttons. Great idea, doesn't work at all. However hard you push it, on top of it, it just falls off. Completely pathetic. On the back, same deal. It's supposed to sort of click in place. There's no click, it just sort of pushes against it. However hard you press it, useless. Alright, so forget that. That doesn't work at all. However, let's look at the controller itself. We've got the 4 rubber stoppers on the bottom here. That's to hold it in place, and a Bluetooth pairing switch if you need to use it. It's useful that it's got those rubber things on. Stops it sliding off things if you have to put it on a table or something. As you can see here, we've got a D-pad on the top there, a pause or a start-stop button, I suppose. Above that, there's 4 LEDs. Typical X, Y, A, B, and 2 thumbsticks here, which are proper ones. Feel quite nice. On the top we've got an L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons. So there's 4 buttons fitted on the top there. Yes, it is quite small. I'll show you a bit more about the size of it later on. Very light as well. Feels like there's nothing in it, but there is a rechargeable battery in there, of course. Now here are the instructions. There's not really an awful lot to say about these. That is the entire sum of the instructions on that page. After that, it just goes into different languages. Basically, you just pair it up, switch that switch on the side there. That starts it off, starts trying to pair with your Bluetooth device. So let's switch it on and attach it to a Bluetooth device. I'm going to use an iPad mini Retina version here. So we'll switch on the Bluetooth there, switch it on the side of the controller here. You'll see the red LEDs. 4 LEDs indicate that it's fully charged, which is nice that it comes fully charged out of the box. It starts trying to pair now. See it pop up at the bottom there. All I have to do is click on it, and after sort of 15-20 seconds or something, it'll pair up. There's no entering any silly passwords or any of that business. It just automatically pairs. So once we've got that paired up, let's start trying to play some games. Now, I downloaded loads of games in preparation for this. This is a page of games I've just got for this. First one I want to try out, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. I said in my head I wouldn't download this and try and play it with a virtual D-pad because I'm hopeless with those things. I just can't use them at all. However, with a controller like this, I can use it. Now, I'm so pleased that it actually is compatible with this controller and it's working fine with it. All the buttons are where you'd expect them to be. Obviously, I've been using the most recent GTA, playing the most recent GTA, and the buttons are where you expect them to be. So the accelerator is one of those shoulder buttons, and the getting in and out of a car is the Y at the top. So it all works really well. So I'm glad I didn't try it with a virtual D-pad. You know, when the iPad first came out, a lot of games came out using those sort of virtual D-pads for games that really didn't work very well with them. Games that were took off consoles and things, I don't know, modern combat, all that kind of stuff, twin stick shooters. They just didn't work very well at all. Over time, those have progressed a little bit so that they're a bit more compatible with virtual on-screen controls. Things have auto shooting, all that kind of stuff to sort of compensate for the fact that you don't have a proper control pad on an iPad. But this is an old game. It's designed for using with a D-pad, a control pad, lots of buttons, and it works fine with that. So yes, GTA San Andreas, with it existing already as a console game that expects you to have buttons, works perfectly well with this controller, as does a game like Metal Slug 3, which is of course for the Neo Geo, which had a decent joystick as well as 4 buttons, so therefore that maps across perfectly well to a controller like this. And presumably it makes the game quite a bit easier to control compared to a virtual on-screen joystick, although I was having difficulty, not because the game wasn't responding to the controls, it's just because I was absolutely hopeless at playing it. I've got to say the controls are very responsive, just like any other console controls really. One thing you will notice, every now and then you have to jump between pressing things on the screen and then going back to the joypad. Now of course this joypad here is one of the first, in fact I think it's the first, that will work properly with an iPad. All the other controllers hold an iPhone in the middle of them, whereas this one you use separate to the device, which is why I picked this one up, because you can use it with anything. One thing that I've had a little bit of trouble with, some games don't really expect you to have it. For example, this one says, do you want to tilt or touch? Turns out you have to pick touch, and then it works fine with the controller. Of course, we're still in the very early days of this, where the games came out first and then the control was added in later on. So I can imagine further down the line this thing will be more normal and it'll expect you to have it, whereas at this stage you can see something like this Sonic racing game, you can't control it at all to start with. What you have to do is pause it, go into the setup, and then pick the fact that you've got a joypad, a controller, and then it'll let you use that. So there are those kind of teething troubles, but as I say, very early days with this MFi spec, the made for iOS spec. One thing I do like, driving games. Driving games seem to work particularly well with this controller, and that's because you've got those thumbsticks at the bottom that give you an analog control. Now, it's not a perfectly smooth analog control. You can't move it to too many different positions, but you can do slight turns or sharp turns, which is the kind of thing that enables you to drive a car in these games a lot more accurately, and you'll find that you're an awful lot better at games like this than you were using on-screen thumb pads. At least I find I am. Maybe that's just because I'm an old chap and I'm used to having proper buttons rather than virtual buttons, but for me this made these games a heck of a lot easier. One other benefit from using the controller is that you don't get all that on-screen clutter that you had before with the virtual D-pad and the virtual buttons, and in fact your thumbs being in the way of what was going on. Obviously the games are designed so that you can stick your thumbs on the screen and not really obscuring anything, but the fact that they're not there means that the games are an awful lot more immersive than they were before. Now, one thing about the games is a lot of them have been dumbed down for the fact that you don't have a proper controller. Dead Trigger 2, for example, as soon as you get your reticle on an enemy, it shoots them. And you'll find that games like this, now that you can accurately aim easily, are an awful lot easier than they were. In fact, some of the games, I wonder if they're a little bit too easy now that you've got a proper controller to control the games with. Now, I've heard people say that the Steelseries Stratus is a bit cramped, so let's compare it to some other devices. Here's a Game Boy Color. People were quite happy with that, and look how close the buttons are on that to the D-pad. The Stratus is quite a bit wider apart than that one. Let's compare it to something else. This is the Game Boy Advance Micro. Now, that's got a screen in the middle, but again, about the same size as a Stratus. And people were quite happy with that. That's got the shoulder buttons on there as well, of course. Looking at something a bit more modern, if we compare it with the Xbox One controller, it does bear quite a striking resemblance to that. Notice how big the D-pad is on this one compared to the Xbox One controller. And also notice how far apart the D-pad and the buttons on the right are, and the right thumbstick. It's almost like they all line up. The only difference is the left thumbstick is above that to the top left, whereas here they're both in the middle. Now, if we compare it to a 3DS XL, the buttons on the right-hand side have more space between them, and are more raised on this one. On the left hand side, the D-pad on the Stratus is quite a bit larger than 3DS XL, and the XL has that slider analog thumb switch, whereas this has proper thumb sticks. Those thumbsticks, by the way, have got a rubber coating on them, which enables the thumb to hold to them a little bit better, which is nice. In fact, the overall controller is nicely designed. Those buttons are nicely laid out on the right. The D-pad on the left works well. You've got the pause button in the middle of 4 LEDs above that. The only slight issue is the shoulder buttons. They're quite close together, and you have to reach your fingers right across into the middle to press them. You can't press them on the shoulders. You can differentiate between the front and the back ones, though, because they've got raised dots on them, which you can feel with your fingers, so you don't end up pressing the wrong ones, but you just end up holding it a little bit like a claw, which might get tiresome after a period of time. But I can't help feeling that this controller is addressing a problem that's a few years old that no longer exists. All these buttons now, games have found a way around that with auto shooting, auto aiming, all that kind of stuff. And unfortunately now, I think they've dumbed themselves down enough so that a controller like this might not actually be needed. But if you feel you've got a use for this, and you can afford it, then this one definitely works. For the moment, thanks for watching.